Okay, so in his chapters on power, Schwab is starting out with the argument that ideas are more powerful than guns, right? So indeed, making this argument from Gramsci, who is a very well-known post-Marxist. So Antonio Gramsci presented this idea of hegemony, which is ruling through consent, ruling through ideology, right? And so Schwab's making a similar argument saying ideas are more powerful than guns because ideas help us maintain status quo. Sometimes we take ideas for granted. Remember how we said we take reality for granted through the process of reification. We start treating things as real and forget that they are humanly made. And more that we get used to these institutions in our everyday life, we stop questioning them, right? And so in that sense, they are very useful in maintaining status quo. Ideas can instill needs in us. For instance, a great example would be advertising. Advertising preys on the insecurities of people. So if we can just convince women that they can buy these products to become just a little more youthful looking or have slightly better hair than their friend, or perhaps lose more weight, right? Same thing with men. Maybe they can have a bigger, flashier car or house or gadget. And so our identities, our self-esteem, especially in a consumer society, become tied to all these different things that we own. And therefore, we become part of that consumer society. We start conforming to those ideas, right? Even the most aware among us succumb to those ideas. Like, unless you were to go off into a cabin in the woods, right? The expectation nowadays is that you are pretty much on call all the time, right? So it would be very hard to escape that kind of consumer culture, and so all of us get sucked into that kind of advertising, the reality that advertising creates, right? Other ideas that are really powerful and have existed for over 4 centuries, race. Even when biologists, geneticists are telling us that there is no biological genetic basis to race, it's an enduring idea that has shaped all our institutions, right? Same thing with gender. We tend to again assume that biology is destiny, and we shape our society based on that, but most scientists will tell you that again, there is much more similarity than differences between men and women, and that a binary way of thinking is not necessarily the only way of thinking, right? So in the newer generations, folks are starting to reject the gender binary. But as you can see, a lot of these ideas are very durable, right? So we had started off by looking at again how power rises out of social circumstances, context, rather than simply personalities. And part of that again is understanding who in society controls the information, who has power to create the definitions of normal versus abnormal, right? And one of the most renowned intellectuals in the US, Noam Chomsky, has written a book called Manufacturing Consent, where he details how information is controlled in our society. So Americans, we like to imagine that we exist in a free society where all of us can make informed decisions about being in a democracy, etc. And he challenges that idea by highlighting that very few of us are, first of all, paying attention to what's happening. We are easily distracted by sports and celebrities and so on and so forth. And the few of us that are paying attention are being manipulated with little bits and pieces of information, right? And he calls that the propaganda model. And we often associate propaganda with authoritarian regimes, but he is applying it to the so-called democracy that we imagine we have in the US. And so Schwalbe in that chapter is also challenging this idea of autonomy, right, versus freedom. Autonomy would largely be laissez-faire, lack of interference, right? You can do or be whatever you want to be. Freedom is the idea, is like what resources you have to actually pursue your dreams, right? So in political theory, we call it negative liberty versus positive liberty, right? So you may have autonomy, non-interference, but what are you going to do with that non-interference if you're dirt poor, right? You need some resources from your government, from your community. So going back to our idea of hegemony, this is rule through ideology. Really important to grasp this idea that Gramsci was presenting. So the idea is that if you had power or rule through coercion, which is what most military dictatorships have, that kind of power is very unstable. It's fleeting, right? So whoever has the machine guns and the goons has the power. But rule through consent means ideological control, right? Which means this is power that is enduring, that's very hard to topple, right? Because the folks being ruled are imagining that they have a say in the system, right? Folks who are being ruled consent to being ruled because they have internalized the norms and just want to maintain status quo. So I have a silly example, but it gets across the point. So if I was the one in power, and say from tomorrow I said, if you're going to come to my class, you ought all better wear pink shirts, right? Rule through coercion would be that, hey, I have a bunch of guys here with machine guns pointing at you, and if you want to be in my class, you better come in pink shirts, right? But then some of you might decide, hey, we could get a couple of those guys on our side, right? And the power very quickly can change hands. But say, imagine I could get you folks when you were young, and I could raise you believing that pink is just the best thing ever. Why would you even wear anything else? Pink is what makes you a nice, good person. Pink is what will make you most beautiful, makes you most intelligent, will get you the best job, the best life partner, and so on. There will be a point where you cannot even imagine a world without pink, right? And so at that point, you're not thinking of yourself being controlled, you're just saying, why would I want anything other than pink? That's just nuts, right? So that's the difference. And as you can see, the latter, which is ruled through this ideological control, is a lot more enduring. Schwalbe has a really important discussion in differences versus inequalities. And he says, in many ways, we celebrate difference, right? We keep talking about diversity, being wonderful. It's only when the difference leads to unfair advantage, exploitation, domination, that it becomes problematic, that it becomes inequality. This is where, remember, he was talking about these invisible resources of gender, race, class, we are in a highly unequal society. So if you have wealth, your wealth keeps growing exponentially, which is why we are becoming more and more unequal, right? So you're already at a big advantage if you have wealth to begin with. Similarly, in a patriarchy, men have patriarchal privilege. In a white dominant society, white folks have privilege in our society. So Schwalbe is saying that we're not critiquing differences, right? Of course, we don't all want to be the same. It's when those differences are organized into a hierarchy that it becomes problematic. That leads him to his discussion on false parallels, which is when folks start equating, say for instance, the objectification of men with the objectification of women, as though they are the same. Racism against white folks as the same as racism against black folks in our society. And Schwalbe is pointing out that these are false parallels, right? Because you have to take into account the context, the scope of who has power in the system, right? And you cannot get bogged down by unique instances, individual anecdotal examples, and so on. Remember, in sociology, again, we rely on data and patterns that we see in society, right? And it's really important to interrogate this idea of false parallels because it's often weaponized in discussions of saying, well, you know, what can you do? Life can be unfair. Men can be sexist. Women can be sexist, right? You have to just deal with it. And what results from that is basically the idea that you can just maintain status quo. Nothing needs to be changed because, well, life is unfair, right? Which is very different from saying, no, we have systemic issues and there are solutions to those systemic inequities, right? And then so he launches into this discussion of test for justice from John Rawls, who's a political philosopher, where John Rawls claims that if you put folks behind a veil of ignorance, which is you don't know what your status is going to be on the other side of the veil. You don't know if you're going to be poor or rich, queer or straight, if you're going to be man or woman, black or white. Then what kind of a society would most folks opt for? And what we find is that most folks are thinking of redistribution of wealth, a much more egalitarian society. So once you get rid of that self-interest, most folks opt in favor of a much more egalitarian society. So let me leave you with some of these final thoughts. In our coming weeks, we will talk about sociological theory and methodology. But I just want to reiterate this point from Schwab's last chapter, which is, remember that sociology means we are conducting a scientific study of our social world, right? That's going to be based on research, that's going to create valid and reliable knowledge, which means we need to use standardized measures, we need to challenge common sense assumptions, we need to replicate, which means we need to be able to repeat some of the studies that have been conducted, right? Because many of those research findings change over time, change from one place to another, and replication becomes a really important way of seeing if that knowledge is still reliable, is still valid. Triangulating means we're using multiple methods, quantitative, qualitative, surveys, field research, to study the same thing, right? As a way of, again, creating that reliable and valid knowledge. And finally, sociologists are always being reflexive. So we are thinking of our own role in the research and how we affect the data. Remember that we only study empirical and interpretive questions and not moral and aesthetic ones.